As the title of this video suggests, what I am going to present here is how I would change Aikido to try and turn it around within 10 years, given I had unlimited power to do so. Obviously, that's not realistic, but that's the kind of thought experiment. Undoubtedly, there will be some controversial positions that I assume, although none of these should surprise my longtime audience all that much at all. Specifically, I have little interest in perpetuating the pseudo-pacifist ideology so ingrained in mainstream Aikido. I won't speak on it much in this video beyond this point, but I have several pieces of content that discuss how Ueshiba's ideology had very little to do with modern notions of love and peace, and how this is now largely a failed marketing strategy that has only left Aikido vulnerable to New Age spiritualism and quasi-martial delusions. Instead, my aim in the following minutes is to address some of Aikido's most glaring weaknesses, its inability to connect with potential students, and its near lack of martial systemization. Implicit in tackling these issues will be suggestions that are not always quote-unquote traditional. However, where possible, I draw inspiration from Aikido's rich martial heritage and will use media and history to demonstrate that these things are clearly part of Aikido precedent. Having said this, I will be proposing many additions and changes to the overall curriculum and approach to training. What I want viewers to take note of is that these changes are never arbitrary and always exist to enable the successful application of Aikido techniques most would recognize immediately. I am acutely aware that some will designate my recommendations as not true Aikido. I need to make clear that purity spirals utterly bore me. My disinterest in quote-unquote true Aikido cannot be understated. I find these kinds of arguments not only to be weak, but remarkably out of touch. So much of Aikido now seems to believe that Aikido is just perfectly fine trudging along as it is. It is just the whole world outside of Aikido that's clearly in the wrong. With all due respect, I find this very juvenile. Blaming everything except yourself for circumstances not only comes across as the position of a moody teenager, but it's a pathetic strategy for revitalizing an art that is demonstrably in decline. We can't control what other people think or popular culture or some abstract conception of the world, but we can change ourselves, how we train and how we present our art. In fact, not changing to stimuli outside of your control isn't very Aiki, is it? You don't determine the energy you're given, only how to move with it. Even so, I recognize some people will cling on to their beliefs no matter how complete my counter-arguments might be. If people want to call what I'm about to present not Aikido, I don't really care. Give it a different name. Semantic titles don't bother me. But what will always be true is that the following is an interpretation that predominantly comes from Aikido. Marketing probably feels like a weird place to start a video that is about updating Aikido into something more martial. The reality, however, is that marketing has long been the skill that keeps styles alive. Solid martial technique helps, sure, but it alone is not enough. Particular to our case, Aikido has an extreme absence of young people. In many ways, we are going through a demographic collapse. This is a key point I want to address, as well as tackling a few common counter-arguments that I've seen in my comments section and elsewhere. Before jumping into that, though, I want to define 3 marketing principles. First, meeting potential students where they are. Second, exploiting holes in the martial arts market. And third, visibility and a call to action. Let me break all of these down. What I mean by meeting people where they are is essentially not one-sidedly preaching at them, which I feel like should go without saying, but Aikido struggles with this. Using the United States as an example, do you think young people today care about Aikido's favored narrative of love and peace? If they did, Aikido dojos would undoubtedly be filled with enthusiastic 20-somethings. Instead, the youth today seem to feel increasingly disenfranchised, left behind, underrepresented, and even lied to, as they perceive that they are inheriting a world that was ruined by previous generations. Now, I'm not here to argue whether or not this perception is true. That's not really what this channel does. And frankly, it doesn't matter if it's true or not for our purposes, only that this is a pretty common belief among young people. In this sense, young people generally could not care less about lofty ideals like pacifism. In my view, the next generations are looking for simplicity and realism, a refuge from the tangled mess of their day-to-day, and from authority figures who repeatedly say one thing and then do another. In martial arts, the way to demonstrate this kind of efficiency and realism is through combat sport. Now, I know what many of you are thinking. Sport is hardly the end-all be-all of martial functionality, and I agree. I'll come back to it in a second. But I also think our knowing this doesn't matter. What matters is that the potential student believes this. He tends to think that combat sport is where martial arts are proven. End of story. Is this a flawed paradigm? Sure. I've made several videos arguing that martial arts are not at all about fighting. And if they are, it's just one small piece of it. But I'm an avid comment reader, you see, and I noticed a trend. The people who agree with my points in those videos almost all already train in martial arts and are pretty deep into their careers. Meanwhile, even when faced with historical sources and recent data, people early in their careers, or who don't indicate if they train at all, generally disagreed with me. To this end, I feel it is best to start renovating Aikido from a combat sport angle first, and the rest of this video is going to reflect this stance. At this point, I do want to address a few of those concerns and counterarguments. First, I am a longtime advocate of not playing zero-sum games with the many expressions of Aikido. I want to make crystal clear that I am not advocating for combat sport to be the sole definitive expression of the art that we must all pursue. In fact, I would heavily argue against that. In my view, every dojo should offer classes on demonstration Aikido, perhaps weapons grappling Aikido, such as in Chris Hines' interpretation, and yes, self-defense oriented Aikido. These should all come in tandem with the combat sport expression. Keep in mind, I'm not saying everyone has to offer all this at every dojo. I get many dojos aren't full-time, for example, but I am saying you should aim for the combat sport expression and at least one other, because not everyone wants to spar or fight, and they should have options. Remember, we're trying to reach people where they are, and as many of those people as possible. So, although combat sports are probably the most popular way that people want to enjoy their martial arts in the US, other people should have a place to go, and you can be that place. I came up in a dojo that offered karate, judo, and Aikido. Overwhelmingly, people joined the karate class because it has a lot more cultural recognizability in America. But probably 1 in 3 of the students who joined inevitably began cross-training in one of the other arts, sometimes both. Once they realized that those classes were happening right after their class anyway, and that the bundle deal offered them essentially a discounted price, those classes almost always got more attendance. So I'm not saying all these other forms of Aikido need to just go into a corner and die. I'm saying a combat sport will get folks in the door, and once they're in, now you have a platform to introduce them to all this other stuff you might be more passionate about. Or not. It's up to you. All I'm saying is, if they're not in your dojo, you can't market that stuff to them. It's just not a powerful strategy. But once they're in, they're almost always more receptive to trying different things. Almost always. Having said all that, let me address a couple points of contention that I have often seen. The first is that certain countries, Japan primarily, don't really have this problem of marketing because it's just Westerners who don't get it. So, I can't believe I even need to waste time saying this, but different cultures are different markets. Revolutionary concept, I know, but this just goes to show how alien the world of marketing is to current Aikido, because this is a sentiment I have seen in the comments section on my own content, and it comes ostensibly from Aikido people. First off, If you happen to be in a country where the demonstration brand of Aikido does really well, then that's phenomenal, and I'm happy for you. You can still use that to get people in the door and then introduce them to other expressions of the art in the same way the US, for example, might need to use combat sport. Second, Japanese Aikido is certainly healthier relative to other countries, but also, I mean, of course it is. Aikido is Japanese. This is like wondering why sushi is eaten more in Japan relative to its own population as compared to some European country relative to its population. But don't think for a minute it isn't having problems. Demographic collapse isn't just an Aikido problem in Japan, it's a national one. Remember, folks, I live in Japan and have been to many dojos. I can confidently say that the young to old ratio is only barely at replacement level generally. Sure, it is much healthier than it is elsewhere, but let's not pretend it's in some kind of golden age or something. And third, the whole Westerners don't get it smells of some East Asian fetishism to me. Just to drive home my point, did you know that Kentucky Fried Chicken is a restaurant here in Japan? When it first arrived, it was not very popular. Do you think KFC whined about how these Japanese people just don't understand our special flavor profile and then decided to pack up and leave because the population was just ignorant to their greatness? Of course they didn't do that. KFC spotted a gap in marketing. They realized Japan celebrates Christmas, well, celebrates is probably a strong word, but they acknowledge Christmas and began marketing their food as Christmas food, a niche really not occupied by other foods. This was incredibly successful, and now KFC is synonymous with end-of-year holidays in Japan, like they have a backlog of pre-orders. That holiday success also bled into the off-season, just making the brand in general more popular. It wasn't that the Japanese quote-unquote didn't get it. It's that early KFC was marketing to no one, really. They didn't have a very good marketing strategy. It wasn't reaching the native population on their own terms. The Japanese people didn't need KFC. Eventually, KFC found a niche that the Japanese people themselves probably didn't even know that they wanted filled. So the whole argument that Westerners don't get it is absolutely asinine. If they don't get it, then it is up to us to communicate better and meet them on their own terms. The final point people might make here is a legitimate one, which is concerns over sportification if we lean too heavily into combat sport. Indeed, this is an issue that we've seen with karate, judo, and most recently, BJJ. Here is what I will say about this. Right now, Aikido essentially trains for demonstration. As I've pointed out in this video, the gradual shift into heavy aesthetics has been incentivized by this emphasis on demonstrations. This, in many ways, is the demonstration equivalent of sportification. The nasty reality is that whatever you focus on will shape your training. It'll shape the whole style. What I want to point out here, though, is that in spite of the problem of over-sportification, karate, judo, and BJJ are not dying globally in the same way that Aikido seems to be. No, too much emphasis on sport is not an ideal outcome. But at least these sports, these martial arts, still have the people and time to course correct if they really wanted to. Now, I don't think most of them want to, but they could. Aikido's current demonstration emphasis simply has failed to attract the same number of people. We don't have the time or resources really to course correct because, again, we're kind of going through a demographic collapse. Self-defense emphasis might also be tempting here, but self-defense, by its very nature, isn't as powerful a marketing tool. A combat sport-oriented martial art might spar several times a week and have competitions running regularly. People are going to get to use what they learn often. A self-defense encounter is far less consistent and may never happen at all. In fact, typically, we hope it doesn't ever happen. It is much harder to pull people into a system that is designed around a circumstance that is rare or might potentially never happen at all. Meanwhile, people can use their combat sports training pretty much every week, and they can even go out and compete with it. I myself am not even a huge combat sport guy, but the reality is that in the Western market, people want a nail to beat down with the hammer that you're giving them. And that's what competition and sparring is. It is what people believe their martial art is for. Now, obviously, I've made a plethora of content that just outright disagrees with this, but again, my beliefs don't really matter here. I already train Aikido. You don't need to market to me. I'm in the system. We need to get people who aren't in the system in the system. Therefore, we have to meet them where they are. I hope that this theme is starting to dawn on you a little bit. Again, I want to stress and reiterate that I'm not saying training for demonstration or self-defense is bad. In fact, as long as instructors and institutions are honest about what they are teaching, I believe these are completely valid expressions of Aikido. What I am saying is that neither of them has the raw marketing power, at least not in the West, of combat sports. We need to first bolster participation and attendance. Then people will naturally want to move into these other expressions of the art on their own. Obviously, you can give them a gentle push once they're in their dojo, but we have to get them in the dojo. For the careful listener, you'll have realized that I haven't really presented a surefire counter to the sportification problem itself here, though. In truth, I'm not sure any martial art really has a great antidote to this. It is my hope that by presenting multiple expressions of the same art, we can mitigate the sportification phenomenon. Having said that, there will inevitably be people who want to go all in on sport and won't care at all about demonstration or self-defense. Ultimately, we are going to need to accept that. The strategic premise here is to attract new, younger attention and then spoil them with options. But the second we start telling students what they need to do is the second we start falling into purity spirals again. If people want to teach, then yes, I would expect them to have some knowledge of at least 2 expressions, or even more, which would be better, of the art. And I'd stamp those specializations right on their teaching certification. But there is absolutely no reason we should be telling the average hobbyist what they need to do, how to properly enjoy their time in the art, or why their particular interest is wrong. It is their time, their money, and at the end of the day, they are contributing to a system we are passionate about. We are all free to disagree, but there is no reason at all for us to be adversarial about this art within this art. We have far, far more in common than we do different. That was long-winded, but let me jump to the second marketing principle here, which fortunately is quite a bit easier to cover: exploiting holes in the market. For us, I think this is almost self-explanatory, and I would steal a page right out of BJJ's historical marketing book. I would market Aikido as an understudied phase of combat, a medium to long-range martial art with an emphasis on clinch, standing joint manipulation, posture breaks, takedowns, and striking. None of this is untrue either. In the grand scope of modern martial arts, the clinch, especially a clinch that is interested in strikes, is actually pretty underrepresented. Yes, boxing has a bit of this, and of course, so does Muay Thai. But unlike those arts, we are basically saying that this is the whole art. This is what we do. And like BJJ, the emphasis here is that it's a phase that modern combat sports have largely turned a blind eye to. While that might be a little bit debatable, what is pretty much indisputable is that almost zero arts today focus on standing joint locks. Later in the video, I'm going to talk a whole lot more about the technical side of the art, but this is the gap in the martial arts market that I would be looking to fill. No other art is really doing this stuff, nor is it doing it to the degree that we should be. Therefore, if people want this, then we are the place to be. Come join us. That's the message we need to be sending. The final marketing principle is visibility and call to action, which I guess if we're splitting hairs, that's actually 2 things, but they're very closely related. This is also pretty self-explanatory though, so let's jump in. We need to be online a lot more than we are. Everything we do and play with needs to be visible. Remember, we are targeting a demographic that believes seeing is believing. And again, Most advanced martial artists know there are limitations that come with seeing stuff on video, but what we know does not matter. We are posting specifically to speak to an audience of potential students and meeting them on their terms. We can clarify the weaknesses of what we are posting when potential students actually walk through the front door of our gyms and dojos. Combined with having a greater social media presence, we also need to let these people know what this project is all about. We need to communicate that this, right now, is our blue basement moment. This is our pre-war Aikido moment, to use more of an Aikido analogy. We need to let these potential students know that joining now means being part of something creative and young, something that will last far into the future, that their contributions now may well be remembered for decades to come. All right, this is all I'm going to say about marketing. I feel like you all probably understand the vector I'm arguing for. I really drilled it in there. Most important, I think, is to remember to meet potential students on their own terms in regard to their values, culture, geography, and interests. The whole "this is what we are, take it or leave it" approach to sustaining an art clearly does not work for Aikido. Maybe it does for other systems, maybe it does in other countries, but we aren't those systems, and America isn't those countries. Also, if you're listening from somewhere else in America, I think this applies generally to the West more broadly, but even Japan, I think, is starting to have insecurities about itself in terms of Aikido. We need to stop making excuses for why the very people that we want, that we need in the art, are somehow wrong or stupid. Maybe they do have some strange beliefs, maybe they don't know what they're talking about, but shouting at them anonymously on the internet isn't a viable strategy for introducing them to Aikido. If you want to help educate them, the best place to do that is on the mat. Aikido itself needs to change as opposed to childishly pushing that responsibility onto people unrelated to the art. The criticisms and reputation the Aikido style has is not the internet's fault. It's Aikido's, and it's time to take some accountability. From here onward, I want to remind you that I'm speaking primarily from a combat sport perspective. As such, you'll notice that I'm not going to say anything about weapons. As far as I'm concerned, the weapons side of Aikido is a separate program in the dojo that my students may or may not be participating in parallel to the combat sport program. As such, this section, nor any section after this, will have much to do with weapons or self-defense or demonstration. When it comes to pedagogy, I want to talk a little bit about belts. Despite my extensive background in traditional Japanese martial arts, I have misgivings about the belt system. I understand where it comes from and why it was originally conceived, but I feel it lends itself to curriculum bloat and just breadcrumbing students to motivate them, which I find kind of cheap, honestly. On the other hand, I recognize that it is a valid form of student motivation and it does have some utility for instructors. In my hypothetical dojo, I would strip the belt system back to its barest bones. There is a white belt, brown belt, black belt, and a black belt with a teaching certification. That's it. How do students progress? Acquiring a brown belt means the ability to demonstrate all the techniques in the curriculum and their required variations, being able to be a competent uke for all of those techniques, and all while having the fitness level to achieve this. I would leave the proctoring of this test to the teacher's discretion. If the teacher wants the student to literally show every technique, then he may ask the student to do so. Or if the teacher wants to make random selections of techniques, this is also fine. The key here is to push the student mentally, emotionally, and physically while also demonstrating a complete knowledge of the curriculum. I'm completely disinterested in live resistance at this point in the student's tenure. They may well have some sparring experience. They probably will, just from joining the class, but I'm not really all that worried about it at this stage. This stage is about muscle memory and being able to demonstrate that knowledge under duress. Black belt, on the other hand, is very much about live resistance. The test here is simple. The class Shark tanks you, and you need to convincingly win a majority of those matches, especially against individuals your rank or close to your rank. What a match constitutes is something I'll get into much later in this video, but do this successfully and you will be awarded your black belt, pure and simple. Finally, a teaching certificate has no test associated with it. To acquire this, all you need is a black belt in 2 expressions of the art. That might be combat sport Aikido and demonstration Aikido, for example. But maybe you're a little bit older or you just don't care about sport. Totally fine. A black belt in self-defense Aikido and demonstration Aikido is also perfectly valid. However, like I mentioned before, the certificate will only cover the expressions that you have mastered. If you end up getting a 3rd black belt, then your certificate can be amended to reflect that. Obviously, there is also some expectation that you can actually teach and are a competent communicator. If you express interest in this teaching certification, it will be expected that you help lead classes or otherwise take on teaching responsibilities to test your mettle and just gain some experience. How much or how little is at the discretion of the head instructor. That's it. That is the whole belt system. Beyond this, if a licensed instructor chooses to open his own dojo, his own gym, he shouldn't be beholden to his head instructor. Of course, maintaining a good relationship is healthy, and having inter-school competitions and exchanges and seminars is all good stuff, but the head instructor forfeits his ability to come in and police his former student after awarding the teaching certificate. The head instructor is not to collect dues or otherwise be administratively involved unless he wishes to help mentor the new teacher on the administrative side of running a school. But we aren't building a pyramid scheme or a massive bureaucracy here. Schools are free agents and allowed to pursue their own expressions of Aikido. Keep in mind, this means some schools will inevitably focus on different things. Others may even be pretty low in quality. This is a price I would be willing to pay in order to avoid top-down stagnation. Again, the hope is that friendly relations between schools would help keep quality standards high, but otherwise we are aiming for a coalition of schools, not an organization. I make this distinction because I believe that top-down organizational authority is kind of what has killed Aikido, alongside really crappy marketing strategies. I want to now turn to actual on-the-mat considerations. It is no secret that Aikido pedagogically doesn't really reflect violence very well. A downward, open-hand, vertical chop is not really a strike that you see coming out of the woodwork, be it in street fight videos or combat sport events. I would, instead, formulate most techniques based on grips, similar to how Judo does this. Similarly, I would make sure that the techniques are applied not only in reaction to a grip, but also in an imposing, attacking way. A variety of strikes would also be involved, but I would completely avoid the notion of catching arms out of the air. This just really isn't a thing. I will also talk more about strikes in the technical part of this video though, so let's put a pin in this for now. The next major change that I would make is putting Hinkawaza, which is Aikido's answer to chain wrestling in many ways, right at the very beginning of the curriculum. Same thing with Kaishiwaza, which is basically reversing techniques and escaping techniques. Once you learn 2 techniques, you will be learning how to chain them together, how to escape them forward and backwards. Likewise, you will be learning how to insert strikes before, between, and after these techniques. Finally, I would implement an incrementalist approach to live resistance. It goes without saying that the far end of this is full-on live sparring, but prior to that, we would do sparring with simple goals. Strip this grip, escape this technique, link 2 techniques together, all with resistance levels ranging from low to high. I know that BJJ regards this as a new learning method, often coined the so-called ecological approach, but this is not new, even in martial arts. We find many anecdotes of people doing the same kind of thing in the days predating formalized rule sets. Some people might think it prudent to jump right into sparring, but I disagree. While I am not a proponent of the notion that standing joint locks are too dangerous to use in live sparring, I am a proponent of the idea that you can't be a total dick about applying them. In a martial art, there will always be injuries, that's inevitable, but an incrementalist approach to live resistance should help new students realize their responsibility to protect their partner's body, which they are so graciously risking, so that we might both become better martial artists. To this end, I would not allow strangers to just randomly spar with my students either, unless my student is sufficiently advanced enough that I think they could handle an irresponsible opponent, just in case. While fully alive sessions of sparring are expected to have contact and joint locks to be seriously attempted and applied, we also are not out to kill each other, only demonstrate technical superiority with the aim of mutual growth. Snapping on joint locks in such a way as to obliterate a joint may be martial, but it also isn't conducive to training or, making friends. It shouldn't be tolerated. That said, everyone should also be equipped to take falls and react in a way that protects their joints because there are assholes out there and sometimes, accidents just happen. Again, if a person can't do good break falls, no brown belt. No full-on sparring either. These themes will come up again later when I discuss techniques and tactics in more detail, but I think this is plenty enough for now. The key takeaways here are the dropping of unrealistic attacks, henkawaza and kaishiwaza, the incrementalist approach to sparring, and the more general sparring expectations. I am a participant and observer in many martial arts. On average, I believe Aikidoka to be some of the least fit in the martial arts world. In this section of the video, I'm not arguing that dojos necessarily put time aside to do fitness during classes. Instead, I will propose some fitness methods to take note of and potentially adapt specifically to our needs, but remember, my personal expectation is that the brown belt exam is also a demonstration of fitness and athleticism. Additionally, the nature of being Shark Tank during a black belt exam has a fitness expectation inherent to it too. While I wouldn't necessarily be writing any of what I'm talking about here in ink on the curriculum, fitness is a part of the training process. There will not be brown belts that run out of breath walking up a few flights of stairs. I want to get into the meat and potatoes of this part of the video by starting in a sort of unusual place. In his autobiographies, Shioda Gozo claims to have beaten Kimura, yes, that Kimura, in arm wrestling. There is actually an interview out there where Kimura straight up confirms this. For a long time, I treated this story as kind of a novelty anecdote, just another one of those interesting connections and examples of how it seems like everyone knew everyone else in the old martial arts community inside Japan. Several years ago, though, I began to give this some serious thought. Arm wrestling actually makes some sense for an Aikidoka to be good at. If you ever have sparred with Aikido techniques in mind, you know the usual problems you run into. People slip their hands out of your grips, or you struggle to isolate their arm from their torso. What is arm wrestling if not a discipline about strong grips and isolating a limb from the torso? I will be forthright with this recommendation in that I have not yet seriously pursued the idea. As in, I haven't actually put any of this in my own training regimen. Having said that, there is a wealth of online material about how to train to be good at arm wrestling, although I have to be clear that I'm not suggesting Aikido people at all need to be champions in it or something. I'm only saying that there is some crossover and that this is an interesting direction to take study. In English, I would suggest the formidable channel of Devin Lorette, who has several videos dedicated to both technique and training methods. In Japanese, there is the rabbit hole of Ude Sumo or arm sumo.
Jesus Christ!
Although this is still arm wrestling, it has a distinctly Japanese flavor. There are a few vintage books that I'd really like to get my hands on, which describe 48 wrestling techniques, apparently with photos. While these techniques may ostensibly be the same thing that people like Lorette teach, it is always worth checking. While I've had my eyes on these books for a while, they are so far either too expensive or too elusive for me to actually get, although I'll keep poking around. The photos I'm using in this video to show you what might be in those books are just available online. The next thing I would focus on is cardio. It is the first rule of Zombieland for a reason after all. For this, I have the perfect Aikido-specific exercise, mass consecutive break falls. These can be compliant falls, but they do need to happen quickly, and the faller needs to get up as fast as possible and resume attacking just as quickly. Sets can either be done for reps against the clock or until the faller has successfully worn out the thrower. If the thrower does get tired before the faller should immediately find another thrower to replace him. Rinse and repeat until the faller is completely out of energy. I've mentioned this on the channel before, but it was common during my university days to take 50 to 100 consecutive falls. Say what you will about the aesthetics-based training, but I don't think my cardio has ever been better than it was in those days. Finally, I want to give a call out to strength training and flexibility. I don't want to prescribe anyone anything here so long as they are devoting time to these things. I feel like whatever you program, though, it should have specificity relative to Aikido. Pushing, pulling, and muscle endurance are all important, although legs too, for changing levels, should be given time. Again, I want to stress that our goals here aren't to make anyone championship weightlifters. Ultimately, the bulk of our time should be spent training on the mats. That said, fitness is important and long ignored in most Aikido circles. Beyond what I've said here, I will leave you to your own devices. There are many, many fantastic fitness YouTubers out there. If you need a place to start, I might suggest the Pioneer and the Stone Circle. Alright, we are now getting into what I think most would consider to be the main part of the video. One of the long-enduring problems in Aikido is its lack of an overall strategic doctrine. Our techniques are generally taught in isolation and are applied against archaic attacks. Let me ask you this, Aikido folks, what positions do you need to be in to best apply your art? How do we know we are in a winning position or are making progress? Or, on the other hand, how do we know when we're losing? What do you do when things go wrong? What habits should we avoid? What are common problems or obstacles we face in live sparring scenarios? If you've watched my channel long enough, you've probably got some idea of where I'm going with this, though. I've hinted at this stuff in plenty of previous content. And hey, if that's you, thank you for being a subscriber. I appreciate that. But don't worry, there is still stuff here that should be new information to you. There are really two major things we need to outline here first and foremost: strategic aims and contingency actions. The obvious end goal is to apply a joint lock or takedown. Even a non-martial artist could probably put that much together. The issue, of course, is everything that comes before that. So let's start reverse engineering the sequence. To best apply a lock or takedown, we need to be in a good position to do so. There are several, and most involve isolating an arm because, obviously, most of the Aikido curriculum deals with arms. These positions include, in my experience at least, a standing arm triangle, a standing gift wrap, a Russian 2-on-1, a position that forces the opponent to post their hands on the mat like a front headlock, or a deep underhook with the opponent's posture broken, a lot like a Kaitanage position. Aside from this, being on the outside of the arm and having one hand controlling the back of the opponent's lapel is also a formidable position to be in. Keep in mind that there may yet be other positions. These are just the ones that I tend to work with. The next obvious step is to develop methods to get into these positions. I would refer to these as our tactics. They aren't really techniques unto themselves necessarily, but they are methods to progress into favorable positions from which we can launch competent attacks. One such method might be a snap down to get the opponent to post on the mat. Keep in mind that these tactics change in and out of the gi. Personally, I conceive of Aikido as a gi grappling system, but there's really nothing wrong with pursuing a no-gi expression if you really want. In some ways, that might actually make even more sense, but I digress. I'll leave that to you. I've developed some of my own gi-specific tactics for forcing these positions, but I'm opting not to put them in this video. I want to keep playing with them and hopefully get some more testing in before I go posting about it. What I will say is that I haven't seen much like them put anywhere else. For now, I leave the exploration of how to get into these aforementioned positions up to you, the audience. There are many, many ways to drag an opponent to all fours, for example, even in Aikido itself, and yes, suddenly all that knee walking makes a little more sense at this level. But don't feel obligated to just look at Aikido alone. Pretty much every grappling art has methods designed to get an opponent to post or to seize his arm away from his torso. Finally, we need to figure out how to actually get into a clinching range because obviously nothing can happen if we're not in a clinch. Here, I feel like the oldies but goodies are perfectly valid. Muay Thai, for example, will often do a kind of skip into a clinch. There's a lot of videos out there about this. We can also leg grab and work our way up the body into a body lock. More on leg grabbing later because I'm sure that is already generating some comments down below, though. We might catch kicks, or we might even develop strikes specifically for facilitating a clinch. Again, more on that in a bit. And there you have it. You close the distance into a clinch, use tactical play to get into a beneficial position, and from those winning positions you can launch meaningful attacks. I'm aware that some of these steps might feel a little vague to some in this video at least. Some of this is because I am still very much testing things out myself. Getting a Russian 2-on-1 in the gi, for example, is rarely as easy as doing so in no gi, although maintaining it is much easier in the gi given the material. At any rate, I want these sorts of tactics to have at least been consistent for me before I go advertising them. More to the point though, I'm trying to illustrate a formula here rather than fill every little blank. What Aikido lacks is a systematized, strategic order of operations to consistently impose its techniques on unwilling opponents. This is what I'm attempting to offer here. It also means that Aikidoka should know at any given time when they are in a losing position, a neutral position, or a winning one. All that aside, I haven't gotten to the second piece of strategy yet. Contingency actions. What do we do when things go wrong or start to go wrong? Fortunately, Aikido does supply us with some answers already. Kaishiwaza, or reversal techniques, are essentially ways to escape from Aikido locks. Henkawaza, changing techniques, are as aforementioned the Aikido answer to chain wrestling and a method of linking techniques together in hopes of something sticking. As I mentioned before, I'm a massive advocate of placing these concepts as early into the curriculum as humanly possible. If you're learning Ikkyo, you should know how to reverse or otherwise escape it. Once you have Ikkyo and Nikkyo, you need to know how to link those two together backwards and forwards. On that aforementioned brown belt test, for example, the teacher might say something like, show me Ikkyo into Sankyo into Shihonage into Kokyunage. That sequence is probably pretty ridiculous from a pure live sparring perspective, but it isn't really about the functionality of it so much as it is about demonstrating that you can, in fact, link all those things together competently. The other contingency action, although it can absolutely be used proactively as well, are strikes. If you don't feel like you'll be able to isolate an arm or complete a technique, you almost always have the opportunity to just hit someone. I've discussed this at length before, but if someone is tucking their arm into their torso to avoid, say, a kotegaish, then they are necessarily not protecting their face with that hand. If you can't progress to the lock, then progress into their face. If the opponent decides maybe he should shell up to avoid getting punched, great. You have another opportunity then to refocus on isolating that arm for a technique. This is just one way strikes might be used, but I'll dive deeper into strikes in a little bit. Again, notice that I'm not really prescribing which strikes to use. There are, however, Aikidoka in the arts past that have looked into this. Keep in mind that when you are digging through the massive amount of historical film, manuals, and other media for inspiration, that I'm not advocating we just lift these old ideas verbatim. They will likely need to be adapted. While it is not a strike, let me give an example of what this adaptation process may look like. We will use Chiba Kazuo's Kubinage as our subject. This is one that I've been goofing around with myself. If we were to just copy and paste this technique directly from the video, we would be expecting it to be a throw. But really, does it need to be a throw to serve us? The answer, I think, is no. In this film, Uke is being a very good sport and taking a big breakfall. And hey, maybe it does actually play out that way. But I doubt it. That would be a great outcome for the thrower, but again, I doubt it. Even so, we can still wring benefit out of this, even if the throw, quote-unquote, fails. What is more likely in this technique, do you think? Do you believe he will go over in a big fall, or do you think the Uke will post both of his hands on the mat to stop himself from going over? In all likelihood, he will be posting those hands on the mat. This, though, is exploitable. The thrower is now either on one knee or in seiza next to his Uke. He has one of two options. First, he will likely be able to beat the Uke back to a standing position because unlike Uke, his balance is not compromised. This is actually a pretty solid concept to keep in your back pocket. If you drag a person to a position where they are posting on the mat, you almost always have offensive momentum and initiative on your side. Typically, if you drag them down, you can beat them back to standing. Beating them back to standing is powerful because it enables you to make them carry your weight or snag a front headlock or just start kneeing them, take your pick. But more importantly, consider the second option. The thrower is on one or two knees next to a person posting their hands on the mat. That means their arms are isolated away from their torso. Snag a Russian 2-on-1. Attack the wrist. This is one of those positions from which we can mount progress or competent attacks. But the key point here is that we didn't just lift this technique from film and expected it to work exactly as seen. Instead, we've adapted it here to serve our previously outlined strategic aims. Hopefully, this makes sense to you. It takes practice, but when you're poring over old film or reading manuals or whatever else, this is the sort of eye that you need to learn to develop. Our goal is to fit things into a system, and to do that, we need to meld those ideas with strategic and tactical doctrine. By the way, Chiba's Kubinage is far from the only technique that can be re-examined like this. One of the resources that Aikido really has on its side is a truly enormous backlog of footage to pull from, not to mention that you don't have to just use Aikido footage either. As long as the technique serves a strategic and tactical function, it can fit into our paradigm. Again, hopefully this is all making sense. I've found this framework for approaching Aikido extremely useful. So useful that I'd argue it is kind of the centerpiece of my approach. Using this as a map, you know if you're winning or losing at any given moment. You also start to have a general idea of how to build out your own approach to the style. For now, I'll leave it at that. I could ramble on and on about more specific techniques, modifications, things that have promise, and so much more, but as I've stressed, this video isn't so much about these specifics. My goal here is to just address the major weaknesses of current Aikido and give some sort of template for people to follow in their own exploration. Someday, I very much plan to have a proper instructional of everything I personally do. I just want more time so that when I do release that, I'm actually at least a little bit content with it and it's fleshed out. There are also just some under the hood things that have to align before I could produce that type of content. Anyway, that aside, let's hop into the next part. The adding of things to the traditional curriculum is always going to be contentious. Before diving into this part, I'd like you all to keep two things in mind. First, Aikido's curriculum was much reduced from its predecessor art, Daito Ryu. While I wouldn't suggest that everything in Daito Ryu is practical, or even that Daito Ryu is necessarily in a much better place than Aikido, I would say it seems to have taken a bit more of a holistic approach to grappling in regard to its curriculum. It had single legs, ankle picks, tomoe nage, and many other recognizable grappling techniques that traditionally we would not associate with Aikido. In many ways, I envision my suggested additions here as in the same spirit. It's about more holistic grappling. It isn't about altering the curriculum because what already exists is bad, but about altering the curriculum to better enable what already exists. The second thing to remember is very much to that end as well. As I mentioned before, I'm not arbitrarily picking techniques that I happen to like in this section. I'm making these suggestions because they mesh well with the standard Aikido curriculum and or fit well into the strategic aims we outlined in the previous part of the video. The list that I'm about to run through here is not exhaustive. Nothing in this video is all that set in stone, actually. But what I do want to do is state the technique, show some film, and express why I believe these specifically fit into our system. One other disclaimer here is that if a technique already appears in an Aikido style of any sort, or in Aikido media, historical or otherwise, I'm not going to include it here. From where I sit, that is already fair game in terms of it being part of the Aikido heritage. I don't think I need to argue for its existence in a curriculum when prominent Aikidoka were probably already doing it at one point. All right, on to the list. I'm going to start pretty controversial with this shuaijiao, leg entanglement. I've played with this quite a bit, and I've noticed a few things happen with it that cause me to like it a bit more than something like a single leg takedown. Not that there's really anything wrong with a single leg takedown, but let me state my case. First, I want to stress that I typically don't apply it as you're seeing it in this video. Here, it's basically a knee lock. You can certainly do it that way, but it's not how I prefer to apply it. Especially because if the opponent takes a wider stance, you often can't actually reach that far knee. Although having gi pants to grab does make this really nasty, and you don't even have to lock out the knee in that particular case. You could also just as easily grab an ankle or something, but again, this is reliant upon the circumstance that the person's legs are actually close together, and in an actual sparring situation, I find they rarely are. What I tend to do instead with this is put my shoulder under the opponent's buttocks near me, and with my free hand kind of do a knee tap by threading my arm between his legs, much like you are seeing in the video. I then almost do a squat type lift to bring him to his toes before shunting him forward. If my knee tap works, he may very well fall over, but honestly, this usually doesn't result in a takedown, and that's fine. We aren't going for a takedown. Typically, one of three things happens when applying this technique as I just described. First, the opponent puts his hands out and posts onto the mat in response. At this point in the video, I really hope I don't need to tell you why we like this. Hands posted on the mat are free real estate for us. The second thing he might do is grab your wrist or arm, which is wrapped around his near leg, to try and balance himself. Again, I shouldn't need to tell you why we like this. An Aikido person getting their wrist or arm grabbed should be like Christmas morning. Third, he manages to ride the balance break without posting or grabbing your hands, but this usually still is going to give you enough time to move up his body into a body lock, or, in my personal preference, to seize his sleeve and the back of his lapel. Now, I'm not trying to say that these are the only possible outcomes. For example, I could see larger guys being worried about getting side headlocked, but this is also one of those positions traditionally trained in Aikido. It is kind of an invitation for a Sankyo attempt, for example. I haven't really run into this issue myself, though. I'm pretty short and my knees are strong, so I'm often pretty close to the ground when I apply this, which doesn't give the person much opportunity to headlock me. Also, because I imagine I'm doing a squat in the weight room, my head is usually up, so there isn't much real estate to headlock me with. All I'm trying to say with this tangent is that mileage may vary. People have different body types and outcomes will be different. Even so, I've found what I mentioned before to be the most common reactions to this technique. The technique itself has the added bonus of being a leg attack, so it's a pretty useful opening gambit, because if you can get a hold of that leg, it's very tough for your opponent to just run away from you with impunity, and it generally gets you into the clinch. If I had to point to a weakness, though, it's that you really shouldn't hang out down there forever. You might eat some strikes, and things will get even worse if your opponent is able to turn to face you. If I feel the opponent turning, I usually try to make a run for that sleeve lapel grip or just straight up bail. I'm not even sure I really need to qualify this one. It's Shihonage to a lapel. Nothing else to add. Next. This one is a personal favorite of mine because it's one of those rare techniques that really is kind of effortless as advertised on many martial arts tins, and if you can get to it, and if you're a little mean, you can really ragdoll someone with this takedown. This is here for three reasons. First, it gives us something to do if we catch a kick, and yes, we might be kicked. Honestly, I feel like there are a million other things you could do in that scenario, but I still want to highlight this. Second, it's very Aikido-ish. I know this is a pretty flimsy reason, but I really do mean that this is effortless. I do it all the time in karate when people don't pull their kicks. Third, and by far most importantly, you can actually force your way into the position to commit to this throw if you really want. Try to apply a Geidan Ate from Tamiki Aikido, which I'm showing on screen now. A lot of time when this takedown fails, the near leg still comes off the ground and is really easy to pick up. Just grab the calf or ankle and you're good to go. You'll end up on the outside of the leg as opposed to the inside, but you can still do this takedown. In fact, the hand movement and footwork are very similar to omote kotegaishi, as it would be called in mainline Aikikai. It's just instead of putting on a joint lock, the throw comes from the footwork itself, combined with a level change. Honestly, just a really eloquent throw. Before I came to Japan, I was doing this more than foot sweeps when I caught kicks, just because it was fun and it kept me out of range of my opponent's arms and punches. I have less practice with the Geidan Ate transition, but I've pulled it off a few times. I'm sure someone out there could get it pretty consistently with practice. I am very trash at Geidan Ate, so I'm probably not that guy, but it is a concept someone I'm sure could weaponize to great effect. So any knee tap is fine here. I'm showing a Sanda knee tap, but you can see this exact same kind in sumo among other East Asian grappling styles. I'm putting this here for two reasons. First, knee taps are just very low effort, especially if you're generating movement, and an Aikido person should be generating movement. Tapping a knee usually doesn't have much opportunity cost either. Second, if the knee tap itself fails, these sorts of attacks tend to trap people in place long enough to snag a sleeve or arm or just some other beneficial grip from which to start making progress. That's really all I have to say about knee taps. I've sort of made a whole video about my reasons for wanting to include foot sweeps. I kind of view these in the same way as I do knee taps. Yes, they could very well be takedowns, but more importantly for me is that they tend to trap legs and slow down retreats. Although generally considered a reap, not a sweep, I will sometimes get into an osotogari position just to get a grip on the back of the lapel, for example. The threat of foot sweeps also makes people move more. Movement is always valuable to the Aikidoka, and we will also be able to distract from our more core upper body attacks. I add this in not because I propose we all get super good at foot sweeps, but really to just give more tools to keep legs in place so we can get solid grips, which will then facilitate our more, standard attacks. In fact, other than the reverse sioi, you'll notice that all the techniques I've advocated so far are indeed attacks to the leg. That isn't a mistake. While I think the upper body and arms are always going to be Aikido's forte, people defending against Aikido as it currently exists really don't even need to be concerned about their legs at all. To me, this is just a low-cost way to obfuscate our plans and facilitate positional progress. If it manifests a throw, then great. If not, that's also fine. To reiterate, I'm not saying we need to be judoka here, we just are using this to facilitate our Aikido, that's all. But wait, you say, strikes are already in the Aikido curriculum. Yes, they are, but in practice, let's be honest, they are hardly trained, hence this section. I also want to bring up a few points in relation to strikes that wouldn't even be traditionally covered in the Aikido curriculum. First, there are teachers who have spent time developing strikes and their stuff is worth looking at. Nishio's book has a section devoted to them and that really comes to mind. Second, kicks and Aikido are like peanut butter and jelly, they just go together. If you are fiddling with someone's wrist, then you are necessarily at a kicking range. Kicks to the legs also force people to move funny and not want to put weight on their legs. This is a nice way to wear people down so you can move them more easily later. Remember, movement generation, very good thing. Third, there are a lot of joint locks and footwork in Aikido that generate movement, as I just mentioned. Typically, mainstream Aikido trains in a way that teaches us that this movement is going to be used in service of a takedown, but this is narrow-minded. If an opponent is moving big and you feel like you don't have the takedown, or heck, you just prefer not to throw him for whatever reason, you can move him right into one of your knees or an elbow. Imagine the full mass of a person plus the power of your own strike colliding. To me, this is an ideal Aikido style strike, if there is such a thing. No, it isn't blending, but it is leveraging a person's own mass to maximize effect. This is an avenue of study that I haven't really seen explored much. The Yoshinkan technically has this in its system, but its presence is sort of subdued and understated. Beyond this, anytime we break an opponent's posture, they are vulnerable to be elbowed or kneed, and then, as stated earlier, we can also heal a person's guard to cycle through strikes and joint lock attempts. Striking is truly just Aikido's natural pairing, and it's no wonder that that line attributed to Ueshiba about the style being 90% strikes was so widely circulated among his first-generation students. A subtle characteristic of all this, though, is that strikes can hide throws and vice versa. Let's say you're leading a person in a big Ura Kotagaishi. Forget about the exact mechanics of how you're managing to do that, just humor me for a moment. During that big movement where the opponent should be stumbling around, he knows something is coming at the end of that movement arc. You wouldn't be committing energy to the maneuver if it didn't serve some kind of end goal. In modern Aikido, what is coming is obvious. It is always a takedown of some kind. But when we factor in strikes, the opponent can't know what is coming. It could be a takedown, but it may very well be a strike, and who knows where that strike will be aimed exactly. This means he can't really commit 100% for a takedown defense or a strike defense. If he tries to account for both, it will be easier for us to manipulate him either way. And if he does opt to flip a coin and go all in on one defense, then we just do the opposite or strike where he isn't guarding. This tactic is really robust and powerful. Obviously, step 1 is actually generating the movement that we need to set off this chain of actions, but I found this can be done with standing arm locks, manipulating the back of the lapel combined with large footwork, or even locks like Sankyo. If you can get the opponent moving on your terms in a predictable vector, you can really load up a monster decisive strike. In terms of additions, I'm also showing some strikes on screen now from an obscure style called Fujiryu Taijutsu. Now, I don't necessarily like every strike here, but I do like how they clearly exist in service of gripping the opponent. My sense is that Aikido lacks these kinds of strikes. I also would suggest that we would do well to examine hammer fists and uppercuts. For me, striking in Aikido is more about setup than anything else. I feel like the only strikes whose aim are to really do damage are the ones we deliver when the opponent's posture is broken, or we are moving them into our hits using big movements as aforementioned. I guess an exception to that rule would be leg and calf kicks, which mostly serve to make moving the person easier at a later time. Every other strike is about distraction, obfuscation, closing distance, setting up a clinch, knocking someone off balance, isolating an arm, or even pushing a person away. Our strikes should mostly exist to be annoying and serve our earlier defined strategic pipeline. We use them to break the opponent's rhythm, to disrupt them and constantly make them guess what is coming next. We only throw out decisive hits when we can safely throw our entire weight into them. Those strikes should be thrown to put someone down. I feel the need to continually reiterate that nothing in this video is set in stone. I'm going to produce a rule set for you, but it isn't like this couldn't be tweaked. It isn't like it could be completely dropped and something else made in its place. There is even one point where even I'm not totally convinced of my idea, and it could go one of two ways. I'll bring up where that is in a second. Anyway, the rule set is as follows. I would have bouts in a 6x6 or 7x7 square matted area. The measurements can be tweaked here, but the aim was for it to be larger than a sumo ring and more compact than a competitive judo mat. This is a gi format and no padding, including on the hands, is used. Mouth guards and a cup are fine, probably recommended. The rules are simple. You play to 5 points for 4 minutes. A tap out is an instant win, awarding 5 points. If the opponent's chest or back touches the floor for any reason, The result is 3 points for the opposing player. A pin that keeps the opponent on their chest or back for 10 seconds is 2 points. Being forced out of the ring or stepping out for any reason results in 2 points being awarded to the other fighter. By the way, this means even if your hand touches the mat outside of the ring, then that's still 2 points. If the points are tied at the end of a match, the fighter who scored first will be awarded the win. If no points have been awarded by the end of the match, it is a draw. All grips are allowed, including those which judo would consider to be irregular gi grips. These grips include, but are not limited to, 2-on-1 grips, pant grips, and double sleeve grips, just to name a few. Any form of strike is allowed, but the targets of those strikes is where I'm a little bit split on, which is what I mentioned at the start of this section. On one hand, elbows and knees suit Aikido incredibly well, but I'm tempted only to allow open hand strikes and kicks to the face and head, but use your discretion. If you want this to be a very hard style, elbows and knees make sense, and certainly from a purely martial perspective, it makes sense to allow elbows and knees to the head, but maybe not from a health standpoint. Otherwise, any strike is legal. Points, with the exception of push-outs, will be awarded without matches stopping and resetting. As a player cannot be pinned successfully without his back or chest first making contact with the mat, a successful pin will always result in a victory. Therefore, no reset is necessary for pins. The timer will pause for resets, though. Striking the groin, throat, eyes, or joints deliberately is illegal and will result in a warning and removing of 3 points from that player's score. A second offense is an immediate disqualification. Similarly, exploding into a joint lock without control or deliberately trying to lock an opponent's fingers will result in an immediate disqualification. Strikes are not allowed while the opponent's chest or back are touching the ground. Ground and pound will result in a warning and a deduction of 3 points from the offending player's score. A second offense will result in an immediate disqualification. Strikes are, however, allowed while a person is posting hands on the mat or is on their knees. If a player is determined to be stalling, he will first get a warning. A second offense will result in a warning and 3 points being deducted from his score. A third offense will result in his loss. Guard pulling is illegal and will result in the same warning structure as stalling. A few notes about this format. First, you'll notice I did not ban judo throws or judo-style takedowns. That's by design. This is a style that we want to stand next to judo or karate or whatever else for that matter. We should be able to hold our own against them. With that philosophy in mind, some might have misgivings about my banning of guard pulling. This is less so a rule targeted at robbing BJJ of one of their favorite tactics, and more so just about Aikido being a stand-up style primarily for the most part. Not a whole lot of Aikido really manifests itself on the ground. It can, but it isn't really what I'm aiming for with this. Second, take note of the push-out rules. I'm a big fan of push-out rules. It creates movement and brings out the potential for solid Aikido to take place. Plus, it just keeps the pace of matches quick. I set the timer to 4 minutes for mirroring judo matches, but I generally don't think most will go that long. In the same vein, you'll note that strikes don't award any points directly, but kicking or otherwise striking someone out of the ring is still 2 points. Beyond that, strikes are here to set things up and not much else. A knockdown that puts someone on their back, though, will result in 3 points. Something to consider. I feel like it's probably pretty clear, but if someone gets knocked out, then that's the end of the round, and the person who threw the strike that knocked the other person out is the winner. You'll also note here that I did not ban sacrifice throws. Doing one tends to mean giving up 3 points to the other person, though, because your back is touching the ground. Obviously, there are sacrifice throws where your back doesn't touch, but many do. All I'm saying is that if you're doing a tomoe nage, for example, it better be worth it to your game plan. Similarly, you are free to take someone's back and try to choke them out, but if you are laying on your back to do it, you are giving up 3 points. So if your opponent already has 3 points and you try to choke them out while on your back, it doesn't even matter if you're going to tap them out. You lost by putting your back to the mat. But if it's a 0-0 tie and you're confident in your rear naked choke, maybe that is a strategy worth taking the risk on. Speaking to the rear naked choke, I feel like it's now obvious, but chokes and strangles are also perfectly legal. I feel everything else about this is fairly standard. Everyone knows what targets are illegal to strike and about not blasting through people's arms and wrists so that they can wake up and go to work the next day. I don't feel like I need to offer any extra elaboration on my banned techniques and banned targets. All right, let's wrap this video up. We are a whopping 10,000 words into the script, so time to finally wind down. I titled this video Aikido 2034, but that is kind of dramatic just to play the YouTube game. If I could flip a switch and everyone in Aikido started doing what I've suggested today, then maybe things turn around in 10 years if we're lucky. I'm not suggesting my plan here is perfect. Things that we can't possibly predict might happen, but I'm saying that even on a good day, 10 years I think is sort of a very optimistic time frame. The reality is that remarkably few people are actually interested in this kind of stuff. Remarkably few people are interested in turning Aikido into something more martial. I think it will take far more than 10 years to course correct, if I'm being completely honest, which is a shame, but I sense that is just the bitter reality. Additionally, nothing I've presented here is exhaustive or definitive. I have 55 gigabytes of martial arts media just on this computer alone. I probably have close to 100 books on martial arts, many of which are technical in nature, and I have 3 or 4 full notebooks worth of my own personal notes and ideas. I'm telling you all this because I fall in and out of love with this stuff all the time. Additionally, sometimes I pick up an old video or book and see something in it that I missed or just start to interpret differently. In that same vein, there is no one-size-fits-all in martial arts. Getting everyone a basic foundation is of course always necessary. There's a reason why basics are so revered, but people will naturally gravitate towards certain stuff over others or be able to make things work that others can't. All that is just par for the course, and I think it's something we need to learn to embrace. Hopefully you've enjoyed my humble little primer here, though. Even if you didn't, even if you hated it, I hope it has your brain working. There is so much potential in this corner of martial arts if we actually embrace it, as opposed to perpetuating this status quo that isn't really serving the majority of people anymore. I think the key takeaway here is that Aikido needs to change internally. And I know that isn't some radical new suggestion, but apparently it's one that needs to be reiterated because most of Aikido just doesn't want to do this. It wants to preserve a status quo that is increasingly and demonstrably failing. Anyway, this is all from me for now. Thank you so much for watching and for listening. I know it was a freakishly long video, but I really do appreciate it. At the time of posting, we are very close to 4K subscribers, and I suspect this one will push me over that milestone, so thank you so much for that. Although I guess if really people don't like it, then maybe I'll backtrack. That's fine too. It's whatever. But I will, at the very least, catch you all in the next one. Thank you again so much, and peace.